Welcome to the Two Gurus Talk Compliance podcast with me, Kristy Grant-Hart. I'm here with the one and only Tom Fox. This week, we're covering whether the government has gone overboard with its ephemeral messaging mandate, the big problems with giant jury verdicts for risk managers, what is coming up, and what has already been a year of geopolitical turmoil, and exciting announcements of the second annual Florida Man Games. Yes. But first, Tom, Happy New Year. How has your week been?
Happy
What
New
do you
Year.
think is the most interesting development?
I'm going to reach back just a little bit beyond this week because I want to shout out to and dedicate this episode to former President Jimmy Carter. He is the one who actually enacted the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the first international anti-corruption law. And whatever you may think about President Carter, whatever you may think about his presidency, that's sort of a touchstone for the compliance profession. I just wanted to shout out to Jimmy Carter for signing that law, whether it was for morality reasons, whether it was for business reasons. It didn't really matter to me. It was the right thing to do then, and it's the right thing now.
That's fantastic. I love that. That's great. Now, I guess since we're starting with death, let's talk
Yeah,
about
and it,
let's talk
it
about
leads into our first story.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I really found this interesting, Christy. And actually, it sounds like from your notes, you might have as well. And it's an article from the Wall Street Journal in the business section, and it's called a pre-mortem, and it's the most productive thing you'll do all year. And in a pre-mortem, the author or the person who was interviewed, the author's Ben Cohen, Ron Sayich, says he looks at 3 to 5 years down the road, and then how will I respect that looking back from my deathbed? So it's interesting because it incorporates both a prospective and a retrospective look. I guess many of us do this if we think about legacy, and that's something that I hear a lot of people talk about. What's your legacy? How are you going to be viewed? What have you done in your field, or have you just been a nice person? I mean, all of those things have those components in, but I'd really never thought about that in the kind of corporate context. So it really gave me a different way to think about how we might look at our compliance programs. Obviously, you and I both are very familiar with risk assessments, as are our listeners, emerging risk assessments, black swan event risk assessments, all of those things. But this I thought was interesting with a little bit different focus. So I was interested in your take as well, but I found the concept fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you my thoughts in a minute on that. But I think that when we look at the idea of we as compliance officers will only be in any one position a certain amount of time. And certainly trends are that we stay in our position 2, 3, 5, maybe 20 years. I mean, that's way on the outside. But if you're already thinking about a post-mortem for your period at the company, what did you want to have accomplished? How do you want to be remembered? I think that can be a very powerful exercise. I had a life coach who did this exercise with me once for my whole life, and it was very interesting. It was really powerful. So if we can think about legacy and then work backwards, which is what this was really about, to say, okay, what am I doing now that I'm going to be happy and proud of, or that is going to contribute to what my program looks like when I leave? I think that can be pretty powerful. Tom, have you ever done this exercise?
No, but I've thought about things like, because of the seniority I have in this field, how can I help others?
Hmm.
I work with people that are much younger than me, and I tend to think of them as either my little brothers and sisters or crazy cousins or nephews or nieces. And to the extent I can help them out, I'm more than happy to do that. Sort of giving it away to get it are phrases I've heard over the years. As far back as college, you only get what you give. So I think we were inherently doing all of those things, but I'd never done this in a more formal way that's suggested by this article. So that's what intrigued me.
I like it. Speaking of our new year, let's talk about the businesses preparing for what the Wall Street Journal described as another year of geopolitical tumult. Let's go on to the compliance problems relating to the challenging international landscape we're facing. And I'm not even talking about the potential annex of Greenland. No, I want to talk about the Wall Street Journal article titled Businesses Prepare for This Next Year. So the article opens by noting that in the past few weeks, we've seen political turmoil in the governments in Syria, France, and South Korea. And of course, since this article was written less than a week ago, I'd have to add Canada, Panama, and Denmark to the list just this week, not to mention the ongoing challenges in Ukraine. So the article is focused on boardroom and compliance officer concerns about the global supply chain and tariffs, especially with respect to China. The article notes that friend shoring, a word I've just learned and am using as of today, is becoming it's a good one, right? It's becoming a popular method of choosing supply chain partners rather than focusing traditionally on things like market size, cost, and efficiency. So, executives are paying a lot of attention to these challenges, which is a good thing. According to a survey by McKinsey, two-thirds of the 900 executives they surveyed last month flagged geopolitical instability as a top risk to global growth. And a lawyer they interviewed from Covington and Burling stated that China presents the greatest compliance risk for companies. So, the good news, if there is good news, is that executives are paying close attention. A different survey found that three-quarters of chief executives said they have at least significant visibility into the geopolitical risks they face. So, Tom, I'm curious. I was a little bit surprised by the Covington Partners quote that China, in and of itself, represents the largest compliance risk. Do you agree that it is China, or do you think it's somewhere else?
Since you asked me that question, I'll start with it because I just completed reading an article in Bloomberg, I think, that China, no, yeah, Bloomberg, that said that China, the Chinese president, is moving his anti-corruption campaign, expanding it to other industries, such as energy, construction, pharmaceuticals, sports teams, financial services. Now, we've seen a little bit of that, but if they move, and previously they'd really focused on the military, so other parts of the Chinese government. If they move their anti-corruption campaign out, I think it will be not necessarily devastating for Western businesses, but become an even bigger risk. China still has 20 to 25% of every FCPA, or the number of FCPA cases every year. So geopolitically or geographically, the area is still of high risk. And whoever that Covington lawyer was, whether it was Lanny Brewer or whether it was one of the lawyers in China, I think that they're actually spot on. Now, there's certainly going to be other areas for risk. Ukraine, if the war ends, Central and the traditional places, West Africa, Central Asia, et cetera, will be of high risk. But the thing that I thought about in the context of this article, Kristy, was one of the most prescient things I heard coming out of the pandemic was we moved from disaster recovery to business resiliency to business as usual.
Mm.
And you have to be prepared. You have to be prepared for a shock to your supply chain, but you have to be prepared, certainly in the geopolitical realm, for a sanction to be put on a company or a country that is in your supply chain or is a major customer of yours, or you're in somehow doing business with literally on a day's notice. And so companies have to be able to respond to these risks. And I hope as companies prepare for the indeed year of geopolitical tumult that we are about to have, they will have a flexible enough compliance program to be able to hopefully foresee some of these risks, but if not, quickly adapt and assess the risk for their business. And they put in a risk management strategy. And I can't overstate enough what I think is you're going to need to move fast. You're going to need to be flexible. You're going to need to respond because the company you may be doing business with may turn out to be owned by somebody who's on a sanctioned list, and you may be SOL very quickly. And I would take you back or draw your attention back to a little over a year ago when major luxury automobile manufacturers had a very small part that was manufactured in China. And in, I think, November or December of 2023, that part that company was put on the sanctions list. They didn't realize that for 30 days. And so they had those parts and they were scrambling to sell cars that either had the replacement parts or some other way that would comport with U.S. sanctions.
Yeah, it's supply chain redundancy and planning very important. I mean, with most laws, you know that they're coming. We know that the AI laws are coming. We know that certain types of privacy laws in the states are coming, but the sanctions rules change overnight. So we just need to be prepared. Completely right. All right, Tom, what do you got next?
As everyone knows, I'm a recovering trial lawyer. And one of the things that drives me absolutely bonkers crazy is when the defense bar stands up and says, Chicken Little has fallen off the wall. The sky is falling. All the king's horses and all the king's men cannot put the litigation system back again because plaintiffs are winning. That is not right. It's not fair. You can't take money from us. Maybe we engage in gross negligence, but just business, really. Take a chill pill. And of course, that continues today. Now, when I was a trial lawyer, we were talking of maybe 100. Now they're talking multiple of hundreds of millions, sometimes billions. And what the example that was given was 725 million for a person who got very sick because of some alleged actions of a company. The message that I take out of this, Kristy, is people are sick and tired of corporations doing this. And so it's not that they're striking back, although maybe that's it if you're a defense lawyer, jaded defense lawyer, I would say, but it's the conscience of the community. And our court system is designed to be just that. And if you're going to allow 6 or 12 people, jurors of your peers, to decide something, this may be the only time that they can do something civilly, both civil legal and civil moral, to punish a corporation. And so that's sort of point one, that, they're hurting us, they're spanking us, it's unfair. That's point one. Point two is the continued imbroglio over litigation funding, because some litigation funders correctly see litigation as, every once in a while, a way to make a lot of money. And if you back the right horse, you're going to make a lot of money, like $725 million is a lot of money. And if the attorney's fees at 40%, and then the litigation funder gets some percentage of that's a lot of money. These are companies that are betting on litigation. And on this part, I'm a little less sanguine because on the one hand, would seem to be taking away from what litigation is supposed to be, which is a resolution of dispute between two parties or more parties. On the other hand, if you're up against Bayer Aspirin or John Deere or you name the mega company, they're always going to have more resources than the plaintiff's bar, unless it's just a top-notch plaintiff lawyer with an unlimited expense account to pay for the litigation. I can remember when I started practicing, trial lawyers from the 60s said, the defense bar is always claiming they're giving out too big of verdicts and they're just throwing away money like it's monopoly money and they don't understand. Yeah, they do. It's just the numbers are bigger.
All right. So, Tom, this original article is called Nuclear Verdicts Drive Up Cost of Doing Business, says Risk Management Society head. And it's interesting because I have always been on the defense side. So I worked on the defense side, even in law school. I worked at an employment law firm as a legal secretary, went to school at night for 4 years. And I don't know. I mean, some of it, I think that at some point, even juries sit there and go, what's the difference between 100 and 200 and $700 million? And I don't think it feels real. So I think that they do have a point here sometimes. And if it's an individual, they're trying to punish a company, is it in alignment with what actually happened? Or are you just mad because what they do in general can be problematic or hurting the world or hurting individuals in the community, but that aren't at risk here in this exact case? So I think there's a lot of nuance here, but I agree with you that we really don't tend to bankrupt companies over litigation. And so this guy isn't falling, but I do think there are points on both sides.
Sound like a true defense lawyer.
Obviously. I don't think I could be on the other side. It would make me nuts. All right, let's
Wait,
talk about law. Go ahead.
no, let the Godfather
Let the
informs
Godfather
us.
talk.
Yes.
Okay. We're going to be talking I can't wait to hear what you have to say about this, Tom. This is a fascinating take on the DOJ and government's recent statements on compliance program. And everybody knows that we've been scrambling to handle this ephemeral and off-channel messaging. The Godfather, Joe Murphy, my great friend, wrote a fierce rebuke to the DOJ's statements in his fabulous newsletter called Ideas and Answers. Shout out to that. If you're not reading it, go sign up. It's free. Joe argues that the government is wildly overstepping in requiring companies to manage and monitor ephemeral and off channel messaging. So, this is a long and very thoughtful article that I encourage you to read, but I'm going to cover a couple of his main points. One is that, taken to its logical end, companies need to record every conversation. So, what's to say that we shouldn't be recording every Teams, every Zoom, even phone calls, because these are conversations without records, just as the off channel messaging is? He also notes that the SEC has the only government agency granted the authority to manage these kinds of messages, and that's specifically to financial firms. The DOJ doesn't have this authority given to them specifically by Congress or in law. Joe is also concerned with the free speech implications. And by the way, the first time he said that to me, I went, the what now? But he's right, I think. The government is dictating how people within companies talk to each other and how the government is able to get to those communications, which does, I think, bring up a free speech issue. He also brings up the basic problems with things like privacy laws or GDPR, which tend to require information identifying an individual to only be kept for the purpose and length of time required. We don't know how much the government expects us to keep these messages. And lastly, he argues that the requirement for compliance officers to monitor ephemeral messaging makes our jobs impossible. We're not focusing on the business or the right things, and that it doesn't leave us time to figure out a good risk-based approach for an effective compliance program. All right, Tom, I'd never thought of all of these arguments before. I was really interested and encouraged by them. What think you?
First of all, when the Godfather speaks, you better listen. Right or wrong, agree or disagree, you have to consider what he says. And he will always hold that position, period. So I tend more to disagree for a couple of reasons. One is that the SEC, he correctly notes, has the statutory authority to enforce this. Kristy, I represented traders, largely energy traders, back in the 90s. And they had to record their trading calls. And the reason was so there would be evidence if a dispute arose over what the terms of those were. And so I've been used to this kind of forever. And it doesn't seem to me to be any different than those traders recording those calls on the floor. Now, when we move to non-traders, i.e. public corporations or those subject to the Department of Justice, that's a little bit different because, as he notes, no SEC, no regulation, but the DOJ has tried to glom on to those and indeed has glommed onto those regulations as if everyone was a regulated industry and they had the right to do so. The DOJ has never articulated a legal or philosophical underpinnings of that theory, nor has it been tested in court. But the Department of Justice has always had cases where companies or individuals engaged in bribery and corruption use code words in emails about bribes, whether calling it a cookie or whether calling it something else. We both have long lists of words that have been used as code words for bribes, and those have come up in enforcement action. So even though the DOJ doesn't have the legal authority, it didn't seem to me to be very much of a stretch saying, oh, you're doing something that the recording is erased. Why did you do that? That sort of maybe begs the question of, do they have an idea that you're guilty before you have been properly assessed? But I don't see the free speech implication of this. He did correctly note that the DOJ doesn't have a statutory basis or in law basis for this, but it's really never been tested. I think that you, as a CCO or compliance function professional, that your corporation needs to have those need to be monitored because it's one channel of communication that can be used. And so I don't see it really any different than emails. in terms of it's just a different type of communication, unfortunately used by most of the world outside the US. When it comes to Teams meetings and all of those things, Skype or whatever you might use, Zoom, it's one of my favorites. Those companies routinely record those. And once again, the reason they're routinely recorded is so you will have a record of what was said. And as a former defense lawyer, I have used records. They tell an important part of the story. The biggest trial I ever held or was a part of dealt with events which happened from 1895 to 1899. It was the best covered document case I ever was involved in because every piece of paper was kept because it was a very wealthy family and they kept them for the archives. So we actually had letters from 1897, got them admitted into evidence somehow. I know I've said a lot of different things here, but I don't see ephemeral messaging as really any different than traders recording their trades from 1993. I don't see requiring companies to monitor their employee communications in ephemeral messaging. Certainly not a First Amendment violation, but I don't see that as any different than monitoring your email. And is it different and is it challenging? You bet. But there are ways to do it. And I've seen promos and demos from companies that if you have the WhatsApp, they can monitor your WhatsApp or your offline communications. So that's kind of where I shake out.
You know, if I know Joe, he'll probably listen to this and respond to you with the ideas and answers to your ideas. So we'll wait for that. Let's go from I guess, the sublime to the ridiculous. You wanted to talk about the Menendez case. Go ahead.
I mean, we're both married. Obviously, you're a wife and I'm a husband. But the thought of saying to your spouse who's ongoing and in cancer treatment, you did this. And oh, by the way, let me throw you under this bus.
Okay, hold on. Why
From
don't you go back and talk about give some context to what you're saying? Because maybe not everyone knows what Bob Menendez is and what the scandal is.
former Senator Robert Menendez was convicted of bribery and corruption for accepting gold bars, cash, and in his wife's case, a new car not alleged because he was convicted of providing political favors for Egypt, Turkey, and I think Greece. Went to trial last summer, was convicted. He resigned from the Senate. At trial, his defense was, my wife did it. And on appeal, his defense is, my wife did it. And we've talked about this before because I cannot believe someone would do this to their spouse. And the cancer part is her trial was actually severed out from his because he's ongoing cancer treatments. Now, his daughter, in a recommendation letter to the judge, said, well, my dad stood up by my stepmom's side during this whole time while throwing her under the bus for her cancer treatment. So kudos for that. But I just can't believe this. I can't believe that a spouse you're still familiar with and are standing by in her hour of illness, you would say it was really her fault.
Baffling to me. I'm pretty sure that if I were in litigation, if both my husband and I were being prosecuted for bribery and saying to each other he did it, she did it, I don't think we'd still be married. So it's amazing to me and strange, but Nadine's the wife, will take her trial very soon. So I think it'll be interesting to hear the he said, she said about this one. And I'm sure we'll be covering it a la Sam Bankman-Fried as we keep going.
Well, what do you got for us next?
Alrighty, so we're going to move on to a feel-good article, believe it or not, called On the Front Lines of the Trade War, How Customs Officers Screen for Prohibited Goods at U.S. Ports. Does not sound terrifically interesting. It actually is. This article is following the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol as they figure out whether textiles were used from making cotton from the Xinjiang region of China, right? People who listen to our podcast will know that the place of origin for cotton is important because there is a presumption in the U.S. Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that cotton from the Xinjiang region is made by forced labor and that companies have to prove it was not in order to bring it into the country. And I didn't know this, Tom, but according to the article, 20% of the world's cotton is grown in Xinjiang. So 1 in 5 pieces of
Ah,
cotton. That's incredible. So, what is the US Customs and Border Patrol trying to do? They've got this fun new machine that can basically tell you whether the cotton was made in from fibers in the Xinjiang region. It does a very fancy thing of isolating isotopes, and they went into great detail I won't go into here to basically say we can figure this out. And savvy listeners of ours will remember that we talked last year, I believe, about a nonprofit that had developed something like this for particle board to find out if it was made using sanctioned Belarusian timber and Belarusian trees, because particle board is a smash up of all kinds of tree pieces and it's very hard to check. So I just think this is extremely exciting that we are getting new technology, that the US is investing in new technology, that this is someplace we're putting our money, putting our mouth, making there be consequences. And it's just exciting. So cheers to the Customs and Border Patrol.
yes. And it really points up the need for being ever vigilant by companies if you're in this apparel at all in the apparel space.
Fascinating. So tell me about this thing I'd never heard of till you sent me this article.
Most people, I'll introduce this with those well-known paragons of anti-bribery, anti-corruption, the village persons. And most people think of the village people, they think of YMCA. But there's really another song that's my favorite, and that's I'm a Macho Man. Here we saw macho economic nationalism. So I won't sing Macho Man, but I will hum it in my head as we're chit-chatting. Because CFIUS is an organization, governmental organization that looks at international trade deals from a U.S. security perspective. So it's things like they don't want foreign companies buying manufacturers of armaments or parts. You can't buy real estate within 50 miles of an Air Force base, things like that. And it's become more important, became more important in the first Trump administration. It continue that importance during the Biden administration. And I think it's going to become even more important as we move to true economic isolation under Trump. And the Wall Street, so that's kind of the setup of what CFIUS is. It's, I can't believe you haven't heard of this, but there's a whole sort of bar around CFIUS review. And I've interviewed a lot of those folks, but US Steel has been in dire financial strait for a long time, and Nippon Steel was going to come along and buy them. And so the question became, is that in the interest of the United States for a foreign steel company to buy US Steel? And previously, you could have had just the president opine on this. Now, he can still opine, but it's a call of this entity, CFIUS. And CFIUS turned down the deal, although I think President Biden, lobbied against it as well. He didn't want it. There were a lot of problems with the deal, really around much more soft issues, things like the head of the steelworkers union was not notified of the deal before it happened. You would seem to think if you have the largest industrial union in a company, you would want to have them part of the discussion, but apparently Nippon Steel didn't. And so things like that really set a very bad tone. CFIUS turns the deal down, and the Wall Street Journal goes ballistic and calls it economic machismoism and that CFIUS is corrupt for implementing that. Now, if you think that was economic machismoism, you just wait till January 20. But I think we're going to have a lot more deals turned down. And whatever CFIUS is, I'm convinced it's not corrupt because I haven't gone through that process, but I've studied it enough to know it's just another process. It's like Hart-Scott-Rodino or anything you have to do in the antitrust world. There's a lengthy list of things you have to comply with, and you either do or you don't. And I, I don't. This is all leading to a question for you, but I'm not sure how I felt about this deal because U.S. Steel has been around 125 plus years. It is one of the great legacy companies of America. However, they need capital. They need capital to improve their physical facilities. The ebb and flow of things Sometimes it happens and you're down and somebody else comes and swallows you up. And so I want U.S. Steel to survive as an entity. I want those steel workers to still have great steel worker jobs. I want the union to exist. And if this causes U.S. Steel to go bankrupt or some other economic turndown, it turns out that CFIUS may have made a call not in the interest of the two companies. So I'm really interested in how you might feel about this deal. But this is just whatever happened in this case is just the start of what Trump is going to unleash on these.
No, I had never heard of CFIUS. I had to look it up and understand what the process was. And I could understand both sides. I thought that while the Wall Street Journal opinion writers certainly had strong opinions, I thought that they really did do a good job of explaining both sides. I guess my response initially, Tom, was understanding both sides, but it a little bit surprised me that they were saying no to Japan, because that has not been a place where we've had much geopolitical challenge in the recent past, certainly. If it were someplace like China or it didn't seem sort of a la TikTok. And so I thought it was interesting the way that these have been playing out. And the TikTok one will be interesting because that's playing out as we speak.
And Trump he filed a suit against TikTok during his administration, and now he's for it. So depending on the size of their campaign donation, we may see which way he goes.
All right, I'm going to leave that right now. We are moving to another article saying, will 2025 be the watershed year for return to office mandates? This is the question. We have the answer. And I thought this was really interesting. So I was surprised by the conclusions that were found, actually. So the article reviewed the percentage of employees required to be in office 5 days each week compared to a year ago. I feel like the media narrative is that this is happening all the time. Everyone's coming back. However, the reality right now is that only a third of US employers require employees to be in office 5 days a week, which is down 16% from last year. Okay. Now, the flip side, fewer firms are offering fully flexible arrangements. And I say a lot of people that I know looking for work don't want to move and they're looking for remote and it's harder to find. So 25% of US companies are offering fully remote work, but that's down 33% from 2 years ago. So huge movement both ways, which means, of course, the hybrid model is emerging as the most popular. So 43% of companies are offering this arrangement, which is in the office, depending on where you work, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. And the hybrid model is up 14% than last year. So the article quoted many executives and HR folks who are closely watching productivity, finding out remote workers are still doing just as much or more than their in-house peers. So I'm curious, Tom, it seems like we've had whiplash on this back and forth. Do you think in-office is best? Is hybrid the best? Is remote good because you can get people from all over the country or world? What do you think is the best approach here?
We have talked about this. We have debated this. Perhaps the most interesting thing I heard is I met my wife while we both worked at Halliburton. She continued to work there until I think 23 or 22. So she still has a number of friends there. January 6th of 2025, Halliburton mandated return to the office for all employees. And one of her friends texted her and said, this is the first time in 5 years I've had to be at the office. And that's what struck me, literally. It was 5 years ago in 2020 when they shut the country down, and we started debating these things. I guess where I've finally come out with Kristy is I think it should be left to the individual because I know the work, Spark Consulting, obviously I've worked from home since 2010. Contrast that with my daughter who's 28 and wants to be in the office. She wants to be around other people. She wants to have a commute. And she feels like that's all a part of the work experience for her, and she loves it. And she now has a job where she has to be in the office every day, but she absolutely loves it. So if you want to be in the office, you certainly should have that option. I think maybe some sort of hybrid form of work, studies have shown that's the best. But when you put a Tom Fox or you put a Kristy Grant-Hart or you put an Ellen Hunt or literally your whole Spark team, they're highly motivated, highly driven individuals. And you guys, just like me, would work as hard as we could, whether we're in the office or whether we're working at home. And driven people are going to drive. And so it really doesn't matter. But for me, I much prefer working from home. And can't imagine ever going back to the office. I can't imagine anyone would hire me anyway. But, you run a multi-million dollar business remote. You are a clear demonstration that can work. But I think it really comes down to the individuals. And it's not a creative or non-creative, because my daughter's a creative and she wants to be in the office. I think people should be given that choice, but I fear those choices may be lessening.
If you use the word hot desk with me, I'm out. That's it. I'm not doing it. All right, let's talk about the PCAOB with our new regulator, what they're doing this time.
Well, I don't want to look at the PCALB. I want to look at the idiots in the form of the big four who are trying to keep their hours from being cataloged and reported. This is one of the most asinine things I've heard recently, and that's even with our 10 stories today. So the PCAOB is trying to put together some metrics to to measure audit quality, and so that people will understand a public company audit, what the auditing company put in. So it will measure things like hours, experience of those, senior, junior, hourly. I don't think it's hourly rates, but those sorts of metrics. You and I both grew up in law firms. We both reported our hours. Accounting firms are no different when you bill by the
Publicly,
hour,
but then,
not publicly. And so the firms objected to this rule, but the objection was that these metrics were speculative. Yes, auditing firms said that metrics are speculative. The asinine part of that to me is if you're an audit firm, you're always measuring metrics of some sort. And they're numbers. It's how you interpret those numbers. And to say that people can't look at the number of hours you work and say, you worked enough, you didn't work enough, they worked more, you worked less, and not be able to evaluate themselves, I think is just asinine. And so I was really just aghast when an audit firm would say that the numbers they put in on an audit were speculative. Now, if you're a lawyer, you might know what the term heavy pencil means. And maybe you have a lot of hours where others don't for some reason. But I could not believe that they would claim that the metrics of the number of hours worked were speculative. And I just was stunned by this story.
what's really interesting, Tom, I think this is the singular most, I'm not sure I agree with you, episode we've ever had. We should title it that. I'm not sure I agree with you episode. Because the thing is, what we're trying to do here is say, are these audits reliable and were they done properly, right? We've got all these cheating and corruption problems that we have seen from a lot of stories we've covered here on the podcast from some of the auditing firms. But can you actually tell the quality of an audit by how many junior, how many senior, how many hours? I don't know, but I do think something needs to be done. Is the something needs to be done? But it probably isn't going to happen anyway because the SEC is obviously changing. The SEC has to approve these rules, and I think the likelihood of them doing that is near zero. So there we go. Can we finish on something we definitely agree on?
Absolutely.
Which is the awesomeness of the Florida Man games. Okay. So I was so excited when I started Googling for my first Florida Man story of the year, because by popular demand on March 1st, the second annual Florida Man games will happen. Now, if you haven't been following the Florida Man games, what are you doing with your life? But in case you haven't, they are only the greatest competition imaginable. The founder of the Florida Man Games says that they are a fun send up to the wacky, crazy, and funny, frequently illegal things that happen in Florida on an inconceivably regular basis. Let's talk about a couple of these games. By popular demand, once again, there is the Evading Arrest Obstacle Course, which features competitors being chased by police. Last year they had real ones after stealing copper pipes and catalytic converters And in order to win that race while running from the law, you must find the frozen iguana and throw a plastic alligator through a drive-through window. Who does not want to see this? New this year is the hurricane preparation grocery aisle brawl, where competitors battle against each other to get the last of the hurricane preparation items and party supplies left on the shelf. And it wouldn't be the Florida Man Games without the Florida sumo cage match and beer pitcher chug. So, in this death defying competition, competitors try to knock down their opponents while carrying a pitcher of beer in a sumo suit. Whichever competitor knocks their opponent over or gets the opponent to spill their beer wins. Extra points can be earned if the loser chugs the remainder of the opponent's beer. So, I don't know, Tom. St. Augustine, March 1st. We'll discuss it, get back to our listeners. In the meantime, thank you for joining the two of us on Two Gurus Talk Compliance. I'm Kristy Grant-Hart.
And I'm Tom Fox.